My name is Athena Marsh. I am 32 years old, and the morning my divorce was finalized was also the morning everything else changed. Though I was the only person in that courtroom who knew it yet, the hearing ended at 11:14. I know the precise time because I had spent the preceding hour watching the clock mounted on the courtroom wall with the focused attention of someone who has learned to stay calm by anchoring themselves to something fixed and indifferent. The second hand moved in its slow, mechanical circles, completely unbothered by the weight of what was being decided beneath it, and I found that indifference useful. Julian sat 2 seats away at his own table, his eyes directed somewhere neutral and uninformative, somewhere that required nothing of him emotionally. That had always been his particular skill, finding the angle from which a situation demanded the least. Behind him, occupying her chair with the posture of someone attending an event she has personally organized, Sat Loretta. His mother had positioned herself directly at his back like a general who has placed herself just behind the front line, near enough to supervise the outcome but not technically required to absorb any of the cost. When the judge read the final decree and granted me the fair share of marital assets the settlement had outlined, I felt something release in the center of my chest. A tension so long held that I had begun to experience it as simply the way breathing felt. In the moments after the gavel came down, sitting in that courtroom that smelled of recycled air and old wood, I made the mistake of believing the most difficult part was finished. I was wrong about that, and I would discover it within the hour. There were boxes in the attic of the house that I needed, not belongings from the marriage itself. Nothing I wanted from those 6 years of learning what I was and wasn't willing to accept from another person. These boxes held my mother's things, items I had moved into the attic before she died, during a period when I was managing her illness alongside everything else and didn't have the bandwidth to make permanent arrangements. She had passed without seeing me arrive at a version of myself I was proud of, and those boxes were among the clearest remaining evidence that she had existed and been mine. Retrieving them wasn't optional. I had every legal right to be there. The agreement I had just signed in that courtroom confirmed it in writing. I pulled into the driveway with my keys in my pocket and my paperwork in order, which meant I was entirely unprepared for what was waiting on the porch. Loretta had stationed herself in the doorway with the unmistakable body language of someone who had known I was coming and had spent the intervening time deciding exactly how this would unfold. Arms crossed, jaw set, wearing the expression I had spent 6 years cataloging and attempting to navigate, contempt in its most undisguised form. No longer bothering with the thin social veneer she used to maintain when there were guests present or appearances to protect. Those considerations no longer applied. The moment my foot found the first step, she moved into my path, and her voice came out at a volume that made the curtain in the house across the street shift slightly to the side. She told me to get out of her house. She told me not to set foot there again. She said get out with the kind of emphasis that expected to end conversations. I stood at the base of those steps and looked at her. What I noticed, standing there in the first free hour of my post-marriage life, was the complete absence of the response I would have had 6 years ago, or 4 years ago, or even 18 months ago. The familiar contraction didn't come. The reflexive reach for apology, for self-reduction, for whatever adjustment would make her more comfortable at my own expense, none of it arrived. What settled over me instead was something quieter and more complete than confidence, which can sometimes be effortful and performative. This was simply the calm that comes from knowing something the person in front of you doesn't know yet, and understanding that what you know is about to restructure the entire conversation. I smiled at her. I watched that smile register on her face and disturb something she couldn't immediately account for, because she had been expecting either retreat or confrontation, and I was offering her neither. I kept my voice low enough that she had to stop talking to hear me. I told her I had already sold the house. The arms came down from her chest. Her mouth opened in the particular way it does when the mind has received information it cannot yet process and has temporarily suspended the production of language while it attempts to catch up. I allowed that silence to occupy the space between us for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, because for 6 years that house had not contained a single silence that belonged to me, and this one did. Then I told her I had also removed her son from the position of CEO that same morning. What moved across her face in the seconds that followed was not one emotion but a succession of them. each displacing the last with visible speed. Disbelief came first, the flat refusal of a mind confronted with something it has categorically ruled out, then confusion, as the implications began assembling themselves into a shape she couldn't dismiss. Then something that went deeper than either of those, a hollowing out. A genuine physical unsteadiness that sent her hand reaching backward for the porch railing as though the ground had become less reliable than she'd understood it to be. She told me it was impossible. She said I had never had that kind of power. She said I had never done anything for the family except take what Loretta had never been told, and what Julian had never seen fit to correct because the misunderstanding served him, was the actual history of my involvement with the company his father had built and subsequently guided to the edge of insolvency. This was not ancient or obscure information. It was documented, it was on record, it was known by every person who had been in the room during those critical years. Before the marriage deteriorated past recovery, I had committed my own savings. My own professional relationships developed across a decade of careful and consistent work, and a significant portion of nights I could never reclaim to restructuring a business that was losing money and credibility at a pace that would have made survival impossible within another 2 years. I had done this not as a gesture of wifely support, but because I held equity, because I sat on the board, because I had a genuine financial and fiduciary stake in the outcome. None of that had ever been absorbed by Julian's family as real, because they had arrived at a fixed conclusion about what I was before I had finished unpacking in their son's house, and new information that contradicted that conclusion had simply been redirected around it. Her hands were shaking against the railing now. She told me I was lying, but the word arrived without the structural confidence her pronouncements usually carried. It sounded less like a statement than a question she already suspected the answer to. I told her I wasn't. I told her the board had convened that morning in the window between the end of my hearing and my arrival in the driveway where we were currently standing. Julian's performance had been formally under review for months. This process had begun well before the divorce filing entered its active phase. He had missed 3 consecutive earnings targets that were not ambitious projections but conservative benchmarks. He had lost 2 major contracts to competitors who should not have been positioned to win them. The employee culture surveys from the past 2 quarters had produced the lowest internal sentiment scores the company had recorded across its entire operating history. I had not invented those numbers, had not manipulated them, had not needed to. He had generated them himself through a consistent pattern of poor strategic judgment, genuine inattention to operational warning signs, and the specific variety of overconfidence that develops in people who have never experienced accountability as anything more than a temporary inconvenience. I told her she might want to be sitting down before she called her son, because what he was going to tell her would be easier to receive from a chair. Then I stepped back down onto the driveway, walked to my car with no particular urgency, and drove away without looking back once, leaving her standing on the porch of a house that was no longer hers to stand guard over. 3 hours later, my phone lit up with his name, which I had been anticipating with the specific patience of someone who has already done the difficult work and is simply waiting for the confirmation. I let it ring 1 beat longer than necessary, then answered. He dispensed with any greeting and moved directly into demand, his voice holding that blend of panic and fury that belongs almost exclusively to people who have been protected from consequences long enough that encountering one feels like a personal injustice. He wanted to know what I had done. His mother had called him screaming. He wanted me to tell him it was some kind of joke. I was in a coffee shop parking lot, watching steam drift from the cup in my cup holder, and I told him it was not a joke. I told him Reynolds had presented the quarterly numbers at the morning meeting, and that those numbers had not required any assistance from me to make their argument. 3 missed targets, 2 lost contracts, documented cultural deterioration across the organization. I reminded him that I had not authored those numbers. He had written them himself, through the decisions he had made and the ones he had consistently declined to make. He went quiet, and in the silence I could hear the quality of his breathing change. The particular sound of someone processing the discovery that a floor they believed was structural has turned out to be temporary. When he spoke again, his voice had descended into something smaller and less certain, and he said I could have warned him. For the span of a single breath I felt the ghost of an old trained reflex, the impulse to soften, to cushion, to absorb on his behalf the way I had spent 6 years absorbing on his behalf. Then I let it pass through me and released it without acting on it. I told him I had spent 2 years warning him. I described the memos, detailed and specific, that had not received the serious engagement they warranted. I recalled the board meetings where I had flagged precisely the indicators that had now materialized into the crisis he was currently experiencing. I reminded him of the private conversations, more than one, in which I had told him directly and without ambiguity that the direction he was pursuing was not going to end well. I reminded him of the exact phrasing he had used in response, that I should stop worrying about things that weren't my concern. I told him that today they had become entirely my concern, and that the board had arrived at the same conclusion. He shifted his approach, his voice moving into something that carried the texture of genuine desperation, and said this was really about the divorce, that I was punishing him. I laughed, not as a weapon but as an honest involuntary response to how completely predictable that accusation was. How perfectly it followed the script of a person who cannot conceive that consequences might have causes other than someone else's emotion. I told him this was about 412 people who came to work every day for a company they had invested themselves in, all of whom deserved leadership that was present and functional and genuinely accountable for outcomes. I told him it had never been about revenge, that revenge is small and expensive and I had better uses for my energy. It was about accountability, a standard that neither he nor his mother had been seriously required to meet at any point in their lives, and which the board had finally decided could no longer be deferred. He began to respond, and I ended the call with the quietness of someone who has already said everything worth saying. That evening I sat across from Priyanka Osei at a restaurant downtown where the lighting was warm, and the room was calm, and she slid a folder across the table and told me the board was unanimous in their offer. Interim CEO, while a proper leadership search was conducted. She told me that my restructuring work from years earlier was still understood by everyone who had been present for it as the margin between the company's survival and its failure. People had long memories for that kind of thing, she said, even when certain families preferred to act as though there was nothing particular to remember. I looked at the folder and thought about the woman who used to sit at Loretta's dinner table with her expression ranged into something pleasant and her responses measured carefully against the risk of disruption, absorbing one finely calibrated diminishment after another because the alternative felt more costly than the damage. That woman had not disappeared in a single decisive moment. She had been replaced gradually through the slow and largely invisible process of choosing, again and again, to understand her own value independently of whether anyone in that room confirmed it. The replacement had been completed somewhere in the long stretch between the divorce filing and that table, and I hadn't marked the exact moment it finished because the most important transformations rarely announce themselves. I told Priyanka I would accept the role under one condition, that genuine oversight structures be built into the organization's leadership framework, real accountability mechanisms with teeth, not the comfortable performance of governance that exists on paper while something else operates underneath it. She raised her glass and said that was precisely why they had chosen me. Driving home that night I passed the house without meaning to. It was dark and quiet, the porch empty. It looked like what it had become, a location, an address, a place that once held a version of me I was no longer required to be. I did not slow down. There was somewhere else I was going, and for the first time in longer than I could precisely measure, I was entirely certain I deserved to get there.